Have you ever looked at fancy bead cones and wondered how you could use them in a jewelry design? I'm here to show the two styles of cones and how you can attach findings to both. Plus, loads of design tips so you can get those bead cones out of your stash and onto a gorgeous necklace. Hey there, Sandy here with another creative jewelry tutorial at KeepsiteCrafts.net. Here is just a very small sampling of bead cones that are available out there. They range from pretty small, but not simple. These have a lovely design, to pretty large. These are 40mm basket weave and so cool. And these were the ones that gave me the idea for this design because I couldn't see putting these around the back of a necklace and hiding them. They were just too gorgeous. The important thing to consider when you're designing with bead cones is proportion. Obviously, you're going to have a different kind of necklace if you use these than if you use these. Also note there are two different styles. Most of your bead cones will have a hole through them, and I'll show you how to finish your jewelry with these. But sometimes you'll come across some that don't have a hole. These are glue-in cones. You can use these for leather cord. I'm going to use them for something else, and I'll show you how to use these. So my idea for using bead cones is that we would have two at the front center of our necklace, and then you would have something else dangling from them. Like I said before, proportion is important. While this kind of goes, it's also an antique copper finish, it's really too small and dinky. It just doesn't quite work. It's cute, but no. This doesn't look bad, but the shapes are still a little, I don't know, I don't love them. I prefer a longer, more elongated line. Now we could certainly do something with this and this, but now it's kind of all so much copper. So I brought these items all to my local Michael's and found these. They come in a set of two, and I thought this was perfect. I think I'll put a bead dangling in between these, and I'll show you how to turn this into something that you can dangle something from the bottom. And now this design I like, with some interest on the sides. So I have multiple strands of chain that will be coming out of the bead cones. Now we have a really pretty design, and the proportions are right for these kind of medium size, sort of delicate looking bead cones. We have a sort of medium sized, delicate looking necklace. So once you've chosen what you're going to dangle, then you'll need to assemble it. For this, I am going to use a screw punch to make a hole in the bottom of the heart. This is a really cool tool. It's just what it says. You use a screwing action to punch a hole. So let's see. I am going to tighten this down. You can see the little screw coming down until my heart will just fit in there. Double check, make sure it's right where you want it to be. Just keep an eye on it that it doesn't shift. And now start screwing, and there will be a little resistance as it works its way through the metal. Most of these metal charms are fairly soft metal, so it should go through. And just that little bit of resistance, then you have to back it out to get the screw out of the hole. And there you go. And it's as simple as that. So I went through my beads and findings and found some other things. Again, proportions. You wouldn't use a big chunky chain. I mean, this is a copper chain and it looks good, but proportionately it's just really, I think, a little too heavy for this. Instead, I chose some finer chain. What I have here is a short length of kind of an antique copper chain, 3 lengths of my small chain, which is sort of coppery, sort of gold, but I'm mixing metals here, so the more you mix, the better they all look together. And I have 1 length of beaded chain. I've made all of my pieces 4 inches long. Then I connected all of them with a jump ring, so you have something like this. Proportions, I keep talking about that. Proportions are what I think makes the difference between a piece of jewelry that just looks beautiful and enhances the wearer as opposed to something that's just kind of awkward looking. I'm also going to add an eye pin. Make sure that's nicely closed. And suddenly the whole thing becomes much more manageable once you get an eye pin into those jump rings on the ends. Now, one end, like I've shown you, is going to be at the front of your necklace, and one end is going to be heading around the back. You can put a bead cone on the back, but since this is finished with jump rings and isn't anything that needs to be hidden, I decided to just add a bead. And I found a bead in a color that coordinates. This is a coiled bead. And I'll just use my looper to make a loop on this end, and then this will be attached to some chain going around the back of the necklace. As I mentioned before, these don't have holes for this to go through. So what to do? What I'm going to do here is just make a loop. You don't have to. I mean, you can just make anything, but since I have the tool right here, I'm going to make a loop all the way right here. And it doesn't matter if it's closed or not. I'm going to use this loop to attach my chains inside my cone. You can do this a couple ways. You can use 2-part epoxy glue. I'm going to use a slightly different sort of 2-part epoxy. I'm going to use epoxy sculpt clay. So I'm going to grab a piece. That's way too much. You just need a piece that will fit, and that's way too much. That's still way too much. Amazing how little you really need. What's that? Not even a 1/4 inch ball. I'll shape that into a cone. Pop it in there. I want it to be hidden. Oh, perfect. Take that out for a moment, because what I need is now a piece of the same size of the hardener. So this stuff comes in 2 parts. One part is the part A and part B, and what you do is mix together equal parts of each. And once you mix them together, you need to have your things all ready to go, because once you mix together, they will start hardening. And what I just did was I measured how much I wanted in here, and that gave me enough for 2, because I need an equal amount of the other part. So I'm going to mix these together, and if you want to know more about epoxy sculpt and different things you can use it for, I will link to my video on that as well. I've got my epoxy clay all mixed. I've got my chains back on their jump ring, behaving properly. Whatever 2-part epoxy you're using, whether it's clay or glue, they all have different working times, different mixing times, different times you have before they harden, so just be sure to read your instructions carefully. I love this stuff because it dries rock hard, so I am not going to have to worry about these coming out. So I'm going to hold on to this upper loop with my bent nose pliers, and I'm going to just jam, maybe, the idea is I want to jam that other loop right into that clay so it's embedded in there. There we go, can you see that? So I'm just going to push that way in. And then we'll set that aside to dry. And I'll make sure and clean off my pliers before it has a chance to cure. When my necklace is done, I'll add some chain and a clasp around the back. And I think I'm going to add a little dangle right here. That. Okay. And now we need some jump rings to attach everything together. Depending on how far up you put your hole, you might need bigger or more jump rings. Let's see, we'll attach. So I think since that hole is a little higher up, these are 6mm, and I think they're 18 gauge. They're pretty chunky jump rings. I don't think that's going to work with this. No, I'm going to need probably like an 8mm jump ring. And then I'll also put a jump ring. I'm not going to mess with these because that glue is drying, but I'll put a jump ring in each of these. Now, depending on the size of your charm that goes on top, you might have to have additional jump rings. I might have to have a couple going over to those cones. And what you want to do is to test it, which I'm not going to do now because that glue is still drying, that epoxy clay, is just pick it up and hold it up and see how it hangs. Add or remove jump rings as needed to make it hang nicely. Let's take a look at this other design with these big cones. And again, just for a moment, think about proportion. I really like the way these look together. I think it just adds to the design. They just all work well together. They're all antique silver. These are Faux Druzys that I made in purchased bezels. And if you want to learn more about how to do this, I did a video on that, which I will link to. But I'm thinking the idea is that you grab these cones and then start going through your stash and see what you already have that works. These are just connected similar to the way I just did the copper one, just with a crystal and a couple of daisy spacers. But just to talk about proportion, these are very pretty bead cones with their tulip shapes. But can you see how different it would look with those? They wouldn't look right. So you really have to consider proportions. For this one, I also changed the proportion of my beads. These are 6, 4, and 8 millimeter beads that I used. I'll have links to those. And I need to add one more strand, so I will show you how I did that. They're on bead stringing wire, and I have here a crimp. So for the first end, you just add your crimp. And then bend the wire back on itself and send it back through the crimp. Slide that crimp down until you have about a 1/8 inch loop. And it's best if the wires are parallel and not crossed over each other. It will crimp better that way. You can use any crimping tool. I am fond of my one-step crimper. Always tuck a tool in there and give that a tug. If you like learning not only how to do things, but how to design, consider becoming a patron. You'll keep this YouTube channel running, plus get weekly behind-the-scenes sneak peeks into my creative process and a monthly bonus tutorial. Check out all the details at patreon.com/SandySewin. And back to your video. And test and make sure that that crimp is secure. And trim the excess wire. The other end is easier to do if you put it on something like the eye pin. So put on your crimp, slide it through the eye pin, and slide the wire back through the crimp. And this is why it's easier, because you can hold on to this eye pin and hold on to the tail of the wire and pull them apart and make that loop without any problems. It's a little trickier to do. You could make this second loop the same way, just in the air, and then add it to the eye pin, but I find it's easier to do it this way. Don't have it too tight. Leave a little bit of slack in that wire with the beads on it, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And crimp, and give it a tug and test, and trim the excess wire. Open up another eye pin and put all the loops from the other end onto your eye pin. You can just leave these straight. You could lightly braid them or twist them. And make sure that is closed securely. That is not closed securely. Can you see? Your loops will jump out. Not good. So make sure it's closed. To add it to your cone, you just slide it in. This is a little bit different than the other one because it has a hole, so you can just slide that in. And because this hole is a little big, I'm going to add a daisy spacer over the end, just to kind of cover up the gap. I think it looks a little nicer. And I'm going to make a wrapped loop. I'll show you how to do that real quick. If you want to know more, I've done a video on making wrapped loops. You just make a 90-degree bend, tuck in round nose pliers right into that bend, wrap the wire up and around it. So you have that much. Reposition the lower jaw into the loop and wrap it around so the wire is again at a 90-degree angle. Hold on to that loop. I like my bent nose pliers here for this. Go ahead and grab that tail and wrap it around this little stem here. It'll kind of want to push up. You can just keep wrapping and it'll push the cone and the spacer back down. Not my neatest wrap loop ever. And if you need to tuck in that tail, go ahead and tuck it in so that it doesn't scratch anybody. I'm going to use 2 jump rings, one to attach each bead cone to the pendant. I think it will hang more nicely that way. So there's that. Now to finish the other end, you could use 2 of the same bead caps, or cones, but these are, first of all, I only had 2, and these have so much presence, I didn't think I wanted to use them even if I did. So I found one. This is kind of a filigree, and it's a little, it kind of fades into the background, which I sort of like about that. I want all of this down here to be the star. So I popped that over, and I also added a spacer and a couple of my beads that were in the bead strands, along with a couple more daisy spacers. It's just kind of pretty, and it continues that tapering line where it just gets smaller. Make another wrapped loop down this end, add some more chain with a clasp to that end, and you have a completed necklace that makes quite a statement. I have one more design to show you, and this one is actually using leather, a little bit different, but it also uses bead cones to point to and accentuate the focal, and it's using leather that will fit into your bead cones. Even your smaller ones can make quite a statement. What I did was I used some 20 gauge wire and pretty much just jammed it right into the leather. It depends on the kind of leather you have. I use my wire cutters and cut the wire end at a very steep angle. Then what you'll want to do is use flat nose pliers, and once it starts resisting and starts bending and kinking, stop. Just grab your wire the smallest amount away from the end of the leather, like 1/8 of an inch or less, and push, and keep doing that repeatedly. So 8 times will get you 1 inch, and just keep going. Like my other necklaces, I have about a 4-inch length here. Eventually your wire will come out the other side. Then you can add your bead cone and a wrapped loop, just like I did on the other necklaces. And this is kind of cool because you can shape it. It's got that wire in there. You may find that there are some leathers, like this one, that actually have a hole in the middle, and that might make your life a little bit easier, but this wasn't too bad to do. Once you have your wire coming out one end, and notice I left it on the spool here, it just was easier and there's less waste that way. And I'll cut off a couple inches. Sometimes this end will get a little ragged. You can dab it with some super glue and then tuck that cone in. Be sure to kind of stretch it and shape it before you do anything permanent, because it gets a little compressed from pushing the wire in. Once you're happy with that, go ahead and make a wrapped loop just like we did on the other ones. And now you can turn your consideration to what you're going to dangle from here. And again, proportion is so important. You can see here how this is a gorgeous piece, and I love the roughness of the druzy, and it's got a little bit of sparkle that goes with the roughness and sparkle of the leather, but the size just doesn't work, I don't think. I think it's just too big. I actually have this in my stash. I think it's the cutest thing. It's a little hobbit door. It opens up with a magnet. You could put something in there, and that kind of would work
It's a good proportion. I tend to prefer things more long. So I wish there was a way, maybe I could drill into the bottom, I don't know, to dangle something from the bottom. I think I'd like it better. That's kind of cute. You can just, so, you know, just purchase things. You don't have to make something or assemble a whole bunch. This is something I bought at Hobby Lobby, and I think I'm going to use this. I really am in love with this, and I've been wanting to use it. And I think this will work perfect. So a couple of jump rings to attach that. Now, if you like this, you can actually assemble it yourself. In fact, when you go to places like Hobby Lobby and Michael's and the craft stores, take a look at these things and see how they're made. This is simply 10 3x5 millimeter crystal roundels strung on bead stringing wire, and then both ends of the wire are sent through a clamshell bead tip, and they're crimped in there, I'm certain, and then that's just folded like a clamshell. And that's that element. This is just a crystal bead on a head pin with a bead cap and a loop put on a length of chain. And then there's the feather charm. And so all together, these three make a really nice accent. So I am going to find some jump rings and attach these, add a little bit of chain around back.
Now you know how to use bead cones, but for even more ideas, you need to check out the beaded necklaces playlist I put together for you. See you in the next video.